This is part 4 of the Progressive Era lecture, and in this section we're going to deal with the role of women in the movement. And one of the remarkable things about the history of the United States is how little most people know about the struggle of women to get the right to vote, how difficult this struggle was, how long this struggle was, and just how much resistance there was to just the most basic right, voting in a democracy. In fact, from the moment we became an independent country in 1776, all the way up until 1920, there was no right to vote universally in the United States for women. There were brief periods where women had the right to vote in New Jersey during the colonial, post-colonial era, but for the most part, the right to vote was not guaranteed until 1920. In fact, early 19th century women had numerous restrictions on them. If you were a woman, your reality was dictated by every woman inside me. Anything you want right now, baby, do it naturally. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm every woman inside me. Part. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Sorry, my Whitney moment. So, for women, not only are you unable to vote, but you have the legal status of a minor, meaning you are stripped of most legal rights upon marriage. If you were single, you could own your own property, but if you were married, you had no control over your property or even your children. In the instance of marriage, if you were married, you could not initiate a divorce. If you were married, you could not initiate a divorce. In fact, you could not make wills, sign contracts, or bring even a suit into court without your husband's permission. So it wasn't just voting, but women were basically second-class citizens. There was this idea that their role was within the home. And yes, they were supposed to raise their children to be, good citizens, this idea of Republican motherhood. You raise your kids to be good kids in this republic. But for the most part, many rights were non-existent. Now, women did have the right to vote in some states. Some states had granted women the right to vote after huge struggle, but by 1910, there's only 4. And all 4 of those are in the West. You have Wyoming, which is the first one. I think it's 1869. You have Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. In fact, this is a group of women suffragettes celebrating the fact that Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho had given that right to vote. But for the most part, most of the country, women were denied of this liberty. And the reason why it's out in the West is because you needed women out in the West. You needed to attract them when the settlers were going out there. And because women played important roles out in the West, and it was difficult to kind of deny them this right. There wasn't a lot of people out there. So women got those rights to vote out West first. Now, what you need to realize is you think about voting. So what? You don't have the right to vote. Wah, wah, wah. A lot of people don't even vote anyways. The vote is so important. Without the right to vote, you are not represented in our country. This idea of representative democracy. Without that right to vote, you can't hold politicians accountable. Without that right to vote, you can't get certain things done. And so this right was denied. Now, it's interesting to note, though, this struggle for the right to vote doesn't just happen because of the progressive movement. Just like a lot of the other issues that we've been dealing with they didn't just appear during the progressive movement. They had been going on for a while. So, for instance, women's rights. You have these 2 women, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Back in 1848, they met in New York, and they issued a document, a very famous document. In 1848, they said, at the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, Seneca Falls Declaration, they said, hey, I am woman. I can do anything. I am strong. I am invincible. I am I am woman. And these women issued this statement, and this statement starts off with a very simple phrase: all men and women are created equal. And they demand a whole bunch of different things. So Google the Seneca Fall Declaration of Sentiments. It's a remarkable document. It's just basically, here's what we want. So women had been fighting for a long time, and they were getting some success. In fact, if you look at this map, it breaks down the dates that certain states gave women the right to vote. And I use that word gave mistakenly because no one gave it. It was through tremendous effort, lobbying, and struggle. But you see Wyoming, like I said earlier, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho are the first. They're out in the West. But you get other ones, California by 1911. You have certain states starting to give women the right to vote, Washington 1910. But it was a slow process. And to make like a comparison, two different issues, but it's just like the issue of gay marriage. Certain states have granted gay marriage rights, other states don't. It was a state issue. There was no official amendment that said, here it is. So different states had different rights given to women. When it came to the right to vote, the big organization that was really at the head of this whole movement was called NASA, the National American Woman Suffrage Association. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, you can see it right here. NASA basically is the group that had been advocating for a very long time. Susan B. Anthony was in this group, and she retires in 1900. And this group had been lobbying state legislators, trying to get states to grant women the right to vote in their state. This organization had been issuing literature and speeches and parades and different things, and they had been struggling for a very long time. And the head of NASA during this period was a woman called Carrie Chapman Catt. And Carrie Chapman Catt, basically, her approach for women's suffrage was, we are going to take it nice and slow. And we're going to go state by state. We're going to get the right to vote in California, then Arizona, and then maybe Massachusetts. And slowly we would get enough states that it would inevitably be all the states, and the president and Congress would pass an amendment. So this approach, this nice and slow, ain't gotta rush, I just wanna take it nice and slow, was somewhat successful. Women were earning the right to vote in different states, go state by state. Now, Carrie Chapman Catt went this approach because she felt that trying to get an amendment to the Constitution would fail. And it would be a big setback, and women would be, back to square one. So state by state. And like I said, there was some success that was being achieved. There was, states were starting to slowly give the right to vote for women in American history. Now, the problem is some women within the National American Woman Suffrage Association disagree with this approach. And what you get is a split. And there's a lot of different things that go into this split, but there's personality issues, there's strategy issues. But what happens is not everyone likes this. And Carrie Chapman Catt is challenged by another woman named Alice Paul. Say, I got a woman way over town, good to me. Oh yeah, she give me money when I'm in need. Yeah, she's a kind of friend indeed. I got a woman. And basically, Alice Paul was in NASA. She was in the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And she is, they get into an internal conflict. And she leaves and creates her own party called Congressional Union, or more often known as the Woman's Party. And they have one goal and one goal only. And that goal was to get a constitutional amendment, to get an amendment granting women the right to vote. Directly pressure the federal government to grant women the right to vote. And by 1913, the president at the time was Woodrow Wilson. So Alice Paul, one goal, we're a party, we want one thing only, federal amendment, constitutional amendment. And Alice Paul and her Women's Party began, very, very symbolic protests, protesting along Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., putting these elaborate parades up that would bring attention to the cause of women's suffrage. And Carrie Chapman Catt and NASA are doing their thing, trying to gain support, especially of men and politicians within different states, trying to convince why should the right to vote be granted. You have these parades. They have these elaborate parades where women are dressed, very elegantly, and there's these women riding horses, and to bring attention to the cause. And then World War I breaks out, and there's a question: okay, what do we do now? Do we give up? Do we not protest? Do we not advocate? We're at war. We're all supposed to be united. Isn't going to look bad. And Alice Paul makes the somewhat controversial decision to protest in front of the White House during war. President Wilson. It's not a violent protest. It's peaceful. They stage sentinels in front of the White House. And basically women are standing there with signs and they're asking the president, President Wilson, they actually began this before the war even started. Then the war begins. They continue it. Peaceful protest. And they ask President Wilson very, very simple questions. We were fighting World War I, in the words of Wilson, to make the world safe for democracy. But yet women didn't have democracy in their own country. You see this woman standing there with this calling Wilson, Kaiser being the leader of Germany. Have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. This idea that how long must women wait for liberty? And there was huge anger over women protesting President Wilson. There was this tremendous backlash during a war. It's never been done before. They weren't breaking any laws, but they wanted to get rid of them. In fact, opposition emerges even more to women's suffrage. And Alice Paul and her people, we know Alice Paul, she's the kind of the figure, but there were many other women who were out there in the freezing cold. Eventually they arrest them. They're thrown in jail, a bunch of the women who are protesting, for obstructing traffic on the sidewalk. They find some reason to throw them into prison. Alice Paul goes on a hunger strike. She refuses to eat to bring attention to the cause. They try to prove she's crazy to, lock her up, and she starts getting force-fed tubes down her throat into her stomach. Information starts getting leaked out, and basically after, this very kind of embarrassing news of, women being force-fed and women, starving in prison, and the fact that women were doing so much for the war, women were taking over jobs that men normally would do while the men were off fighting, it became more and more difficult to ignore this basic demand. And because of the roles of women in World War I, and because of all the struggle, eventually you get, finally, in 1920, you get an amendment to the Constitution, the 19th Amendment. And the 19th Amendment does something very basic and very simple. The right of citizens of the U.S. to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or by any state on account of sex. So women get this right to vote in 1920, and it's a huge victory. But it's not over. I mean, we still have various issues with gender in this country, obviously. A really good movie, even though it's kind of Hollywood-like, Iron Jawed Angels does a really good job at kind of breaking down this struggle for women to vote. And one of the things that happens during this progressive era is you get women increasingly, it's not just Alice Paul, it's not just Jane Addams, but other women breaking down this idea of the domestic sphere. This idea that women's place is in the home and only in the home weakens during this time. It doesn't go away, but you have this idea where women are coming out in these public roles and being involved in anti-child labor, just basically protesting the nation's food treatment. People involved in the settlement house movement. You have women like Emma Goldman here in her mugshot. She was arrested for anarchism, but she was lecturing about feminism. You have Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger is the one who came up with the term birth control, and she was actually arrested for obscenity for even talking about birth control. This is whoa. This is the fact that women would have sex not just for reproduction. So the idea of birth control. Florence Kelly was involved with the Hull House with Jane Addams, and later on will help pass some child labor laws. But you have women during the Progressive era taking on these new roles in American society. And so this is another part of the Progressive era.